Welcome to the Stillness Broadcast. Tonight we explore the spaces where comfort becomes cage, where the familiar reveals teeth we never noticed before. I'd love to know, where are you listening from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. There's something profound about knowing we're scattered across the world, but gathered here in the dark together, each of us alone, but somehow connected through these stories. If you find yourself drawn back to this darkness, you know where the subscribe button waits. Let's begin. Story 1. The Valdosta Community Center smelled of cardboard and November cold when Graham Vickers arrived at 6:47 on a Thursday morning. He stood at the loading dock, watching his breath condense in air that tasted of diesel and coming rain, and try to remember when he'd last felt necessary. Graham was 49 years old, recently terminated from a quality assurance position at a pharmaceutical company after 18 years of meticulous documentation. The divorce had been finalized 6 months ago. His daughter Ashley no longer returned his calls. The charity work, organizing the annual winter drive, was all that remained of his identity as someone who helped, someone who mattered, someone who made the world incrementally better through careful attention to detail. He unlocked the loading bay and flipped switches. Fluorescent lights stuttered to life with a buzz that made his back teeth ache. The donation center occupied what had once been a grocery store, all concrete floors and industrial shelving, the air holding a permanent chill that no amount of heating could quite dispel. The first truck arrived at 7:15. Graham checked items against his intake sheets, color-coded by category, cross-referenced with projected need: clothing, housewares, furniture, toys. Everything logged, everything accounted for. Control was comfort when everything else felt uncertain. By 9:30, the bay was half full. Graham moved between stacks of boxes, verifying contents, updating his spreadsheet. This was the part he loved. The organization, the systematic transformation of chaos into order. Each donated item represented someone's past, but more importantly, someone else's future. Purpose rendered tangible. He was checking a box of kitchen items when he found the painting. It was small, maybe 8 by 10 inches, in a simple wooden frame that looked handmade. The canvas showed a window, just a window, nothing extraordinary about it. 4 panes, white trim, curtains pulled back to reveal darkness beyond. The perspective was slightly off, the proportion suggesting the artist had worked from memory rather than reference. Graham turned the frame over. On the backing, written in faded pencil, Master Bedroom, 1847 Ashwood Drive, August 1993. Something about the painting made his chest feel tight. He held it at arm's length, studying the brushwork. The window was rendered in careful detail, but the darkness beyond the glass seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at it. A trick of the fluorescent lights, probably. Or his eyes, tired from screen work and inadequate sleep. He set the painting aside and continued processing donations. At 11, Patricia Odom arrived for her volunteer shift. Patricia had helmet hair the color of champagne and an aggressive smile that suggested she'd been beautiful once and hadn't quite accepted the past tense. "What's that?" She pointed to the painting, which Graham had propped against a box of crockery. "Estate sale donation," he said. "Might be worth checking if it's got any value." That address on the back could be Providence. Patricia picked up the painting, tilted it toward the light. "It's just a window." "I know. Not even a particularly interesting window." She set it down. "Probably worth $3 at our sale. Maybe 5 if we clean the frame." But Graham found himself returning to the painting throughout the day. Between logging a box of children's books and sorting winter coats by size, he'd glance at it, and each time the darkness beyond the painted glass seemed deeper, more textured, as though the artist had mixed shadow itself into the paint. At 3:45, he was alone in the bay. Patricia had left for a dentist appointment. The other volunteers wouldn't arrive until after 5. Graham stood before the painting, really looking at it now. The window was the master bedroom window of a house on Ashwood Drive. Someone had painted it in August of 1993. Why? Who paints a window? Not the view from the window, not the room containing it. Just the window itself. Just the frame and glass and the darkness pressing against the panes from outside. He pulled out his phone and searched for the address. The results came quickly. Too quickly. Graham felt his mouth go dry as he read. 1847 Ashwood Drive had been demolished in 2006. Before that, it had sat empty for 13 years. Before that, August 1993, Rebecca Hale, age 31, had died there. Suicide, the brief newspaper article stated. Discovered by her husband when he returned from a business trip. She'd hanged herself in the master bedroom. Graham set his phone down with a hand that trembled slightly. Just a coincidence. Estate sales contained the possessions of the dead all the time. Someone had painted a window. Someone else had died in the room that window belonged to. Tragic, but not connected. Not meaningful. He tried to return to work, but his attention kept snagging on the painting. At 5:30, with the loading bay empty and the evening volunteers busy in the retail space up front, Graham did something he knew was inappropriate but couldn't quite stop himself from doing. He took the painting to his car. Just to research it properly, he told himself. Just to see if it had value. The charity deserved due diligence. His apartment was in a converted warehouse on the east side of town, all exposed, brick and the particular echo of large empty spaces. Graham had moved here after the divorce, unable to afford the house he'd lived in for 12 years, unable to bear staying in rooms that still smelled faintly of his wife's perfume and his daughter's shampoo. He propped the painting on his kitchen counter and made coffee he didn't drink. Through his window, he could see the November sunset turning the sky the color of a healing bruise. He should return the painting tomorrow. He should log it properly and price it at $5 and let someone buy it without knowing its history. But he kept looking at the darkness beyond the painted glass. At 8:40, Graham fell asleep on his couch with his laptop open to articles about Rebecca Hale. There weren't many. She'd been a graphic designer, worked from home, no children. Her husband, Marcus Hale, had found her body. No note, no apparent motive. Depression, the article suggested vaguely, though none quoted anyone who'd known her well, enough to confirm it. Graham dreamed of windows. He woke at 3:18 in the morning to find his apartment freezing. The heat was on, he could hear it running, but the air felt like January, like something had opened a door to winter and forgotten to close it. The painting was still on his counter, but in the darkness of 3 a.m. the window it depicted seemed to glow faintly, as though lit from behind by a source that shouldn't exist in a two-dimensional representation of a demolished house. Graham stood, his breath visible now, and approached the counter slowly. The darkness beyond the painted window was moving. Not the trick of fluorescent lights this time, but actual movement. Something shifting in that painted space that should have been flat pigment on canvas. As he watched, the darkness pressed against the glass from inside, bulging slightly, testing the barrier between painted space and his kitchen. He reached for the painting. His fingers were inches from the frame when he heard it, tapping, soft, rhythmic, deliberate, fingernails against glass, coming from the painting. Graham jerked his hand back. The tapping continued. Tap, 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 tap. A pattern, almost. A request. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out. He should have thrown the painting away. Should have taken it to the dumpster behind his building and let the morning trash collection solve this problem. But Graham had spent his entire adult life documenting, analyzing, understanding. He needed to know what this was before he could dismiss it. He returned to his laptop and searched deeper. The articles about Rebecca Hale were sparse, but property records were thorough. Graham traced the ownership of 1847 Ashwood Drive backward through time. The house had been built in 1952. The Hales had bought it in 1989. Before that, it had belonged to Gerald and Martha Sykes for 31 years. He kept digging. Martha Sykes had died in 1987. The obituary was brief. She'd been 63. Survived by her husband. No cause of death listed, but when Graham cross-referenced with newspaper archives, he found it. Suicide. Hanged herself in the master bedroom. His coffee had gone cold. Outside, the November darkness pressed against his windows like something that wanted in. Graham went further back. The Sykes had bought the house from Donald and Claire Patterson in 1958. Claire Patterson, age 41, had died in 1956. Suicide. Master bedroom. Hanging. The pattern was impossible to ignore now. Every woman who'd lived in that house long enough had died the same way in the same room. 3 confirmed cases spanning 41 years. And Graham was willing to bet that if he dug further, he'd find more. The tapping had stopped. He looked at the painting. The darkness beyond the window had retreated slightly, no longer pressing against the glass, but still there, still waiting. What had someone tried to trap by painting that window? Or what had someone accidentally captured? Graham spent the rest of the night researching. By dawn, he'd found 2 more deaths. 1949, Elizabeth Brennan, the house's first occupant's wife. 1972, Sarah Mendez, Martha Sykes' sister, who'd visited for 3 months and never left. 5 women, all hangings, all in the master bedroom, all staring at that window before they died. At 7 a.m., Graham called Patricia. "I need to pull a donation," he said. "The painting from yesterday. I think it might be contaminated." "Contaminated? Wrong word. I mean, I found some troubling history. I don't think we should sell it." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Graham, have you been awake all night?" "That's not relevant." "It's extremely relevant. You sound manic. When's the last time you slept properly?" "I'm fine. I just need to make sure this painting doesn't get sold." "Okay," Patricia said slowly. "Okay, why don't you take the day off? I'll handle intake." She didn't believe him. Graham could hear it in her voice, that careful tone people used when they thought you were crumbling. He'd heard it before, from his ex-wife, from his daughter, from the HR representative who'd administered his termination. He hung up and looked at the painting. The window was just a window now, in morning light. Flat paint on canvas. Nothing supernatural about it. Nothing impossible. Just 4 panes of glass, and darkness beyond that. Could be night sky, or could be a basement, or could be nothing at all. Just the absence of detail. Just lazy artistry. But Graham had learned to pay attention to details. That's what quality assurance meant. Finding the flaws, documenting the deviations, maintaining standards against entropy's constant pressure. This painting had killed 5 women. Somehow. He didn't understand the mechanism, but he understood patterns. Patterns didn't lie. He should destroy it, should take it to the parking lot and smash the frame, burn the canvas, scatter the ashes somewhere sunlight reached. should eliminate the hazard before it could hurt anyone else. But Graham hesitated. If he destroyed it, he'd never understand how it worked. He'd spend the rest of his life wondering if he'd imagined everything, if the pattern was just coincidence, if his isolation and desperation had created meaning where none existed. And more than that, more than curiosity, was the shameful recognition that this painting had given him something he'd been missing since the divorce, since the termination, since his daughter's last ignored phone call. Purpose, something that needed him specifically, needed his attention and documentation, needed his ability to see patterns others missed. The painting was dangerous, yes, but it was also proof that he'd been right all along, that careful observation mattered, that small details contained large truths, that he wasn't paranoid or obsessive, just more thorough than people who missed things. Graham took the painting to his bedroom and hung it on the wall opposite his bed. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in his desk chair, laptop open to a document titled Observation Log, and watched the painting. At 3:18, the same time he'd woken the night before, the darkness beyond the window began to move again. Graham typed steadily, documenting everything. The darkness pressed against the glass, bulging outward in a way that violated the two-dimensional nature of canvas. Something was in there, behind that painted window. Something that wanted out, or wanted in, or simply wanted. With an appetite that predated language. The tapping started at 3:22. Graham noted the time. At 3:37, frost began forming on the painted glass. Actual frost, crystallizing on paint, spreading in fractals that suggested mathematical precision beyond human capacity for pattern. Graham's bedroom was freezing now, his breath coming in clouds, but he kept typing. At 4:01, he saw her, a figure pressed against the glass from the other side. Too dark to see clearly, just a silhouette. A woman-shaped shadow standing at that painted window, looking out, looking at him. Graham's fingers froze over his keyboard. The figure raised one hand and placed it flat against the glass. 5 fingers, palm, wrist disappearing into darkness. A hand that shouldn't exist in a painting created 30 years ago. Then she tapped. The same rhythm he'd heard before. Let me out, let me out, let me out. Rebecca Hale, Graham whispered. The figure went still. Then she pressed both hands against the glass, and Graham could see her face now, blurred by darkness and paint. But there, eyes too wide, mouth open in a shape that suggested screaming, though no sound came through. She'd been trapped. That's what the painting did. Captured them somehow, pulled them into that darkness beyond the window, held them in painted space while their bodies hung in the master bedroom at 1847 Ashwood Drive. "I can't let you out," Graham said. The figure's hands slid down the glass slowly, leaving no trail, no mark, just the gesture of dissent, of giving up. Graham watched until dawn broke, and the figure faded back into darkness. Over the next week, he fell into a routine. Work during the day, observation at night. Patricia noticed his exhaustion, suggested he take time off, maybe see someone about his stress levels. Graham smiled and deflected and continued documenting. Each night the figure appeared at 3:18, sometimes just standing at the window, sometimes tapping, sometimes pressing her whole body against the glass as though trying to break through by force of will alone. Graham learned her patterns, documented her behaviors, created spreadsheets tracking correlation between lunar phases and activity levels, between barometric pressure and the intensity of the cold that accompanied her appearances. This was what he was good at: observation, documentation, finding meaning in data. The painting had given him purpose again, had made him necessary, even if he was only necessary to himself, even if his careful logs would never be read by anyone who mattered. His daughter called on the 13th day. Graham almost didn't answer. "Dad?" Ashley's voice was careful, measured. "Patricia called me. She's worried about you." "I'm fine. She said you've been acting strange, missing shifts, talking about a painting. I'm doing research. It's important." "Dad," Ashley sighed. "Mom and we've been talking. We think maybe you should talk to someone, a professional, just to..." Graham hung up. That night, the figure appeared at 3:18 as always, but something was different. She wasn't alone. Behind her in the darkness, Graham could see other shapes now. 4 more figures, women-shaped shadows standing in a room that shouldn't exist behind a window that had been demolished 19 years ago. All 5 of them pressed their hands against the glass. All 5 of them looked at him, with eyes too wide and mouths open in silent screaming. Graham understood then. The painting didn't just trap them, it collected them. Each woman who'd stared at that window long enough, each woman who'd stood in that master bedroom and felt the pull of the darkness beyond the glass, each woman who'd chosen hanging as her exit because hanging was what the window showed them, what it promised, what it whispered in a voice below hearing. They were all still there, all still aware, all still trapped in that painted space where time meant nothing and rescue was impossible. And Graham had hung it on his wall. He should take it down, should destroy it now, should free them, if freedom was even possible, after decades in darkness, should stop feeding it his attention, his observation, his meticulous documentation. But when he stood and approached the painting, when he reached for the frame, the 5 figures pressed harder against the glass, and their faces came clearer in the painted darkness. And Graham saw something in there, expressions that wasn't quite pleading and wasn't quite warning. They were trying to tell him something. The pattern wasn't complete. 5 women over 70 years, each one pulled into the painting, each one trapped behind that window. But the pattern had been broken when the house was demolished. No more women staring at that window. No more chances for the painting to feed. Unless someone brought it whole. Unless someone hung it where they could see it from their bed. Unless someone spent night after night watching it, documenting it, giving it the attention it needed to complete its collection. Graham looked down at his hand, still reaching for the frame, and saw that his fingers were shaking. Not from fear, from anticipation. He'd been so focused on documenting the women in the painting that he'd never questioned why the painting had found him specifically, why it had been in that donation box at that time, why he'd felt such compulsion to take it home. The painting didn't just trap women, it trapped anyone who looked at it long enough, anyone who tried to understand it, anyone isolated and desperate enough to mistake documentation for purpose. And Graham had been documenting himself into its collection for 13 days. He stepped back from the painting. His bedroom was freezing, his breath coming in clouds that caught the moonlight like small ghosts. The 5 figures watched him from behind the glass with expressions he could finally read. Not pleading, welcoming. There was space for one more behind that window. Space for someone who'd spent his life organizing, documenting, maintaining control. Someone who'd lost his job, his marriage, his daughter's love. Someone who'd found purpose only in observation, who'd felt necessary only when cataloging other people's suffering. The pattern wanted completion, Graham's phone buzzed. A text from Ashley. "Dad, please call me back. I'm sorry I was harsh. I'm worried." He looked at the text, looked at the painting, looked at his reflection in his bedroom mirror, and saw how thin he'd become, how dark the circles under his eyes, how much he already resembled something trapped in darkness. The figures in the painting pressed against the glass, and Graham heard something he'd never heard before. Not tapping, not silence, but voices, thin as wire, promising him what he'd been searching for. Belonging, purpose, a place where his observation would never end, where documentation was eternal, where he would finally, permanently matter, even if only to the darkness. Graham picked up his phone and deleted Ashley's text. Then he got into bed and turned off his lamp and lay in the darkness watching the painted window, waiting for 3:18 when the figures would appear and he would finally understand what they'd been trying to tell him all along. Control was all he had left, and control had abandoned him days ago. Story 2. The apartment smelled of nothing when Cora Geller first crossed its threshold. She stood in the center of the living room, breathing carefully through her nose, testing the air. Her therapist had encouraged mindful engagement with space, though Dr. Ringgold had never explained what one was supposed to do when space itself seemed to be holding its breath. Cora was 32 years old and had spent the last 14 months in treatment for generalized anxiety disorder, complicated by agoraphobia that had, at its worst, confined her to a single room in her mother's house. The apartment was her re-emergence, her proof that she could exist independently, that she could live in the world without every sound and shadow translating into threat. The apartment was in a converted textile mill on the north side of Baltimore, all exposed brick and industrial windows, the kind of place that looked charming in photographs and revealed its flaws slowly over time. 600 square feet, one bedroom, month-to-month lease. The landlord, a man named Chen with kind eyes and a persistent cough, had seemed almost apologetic about how cheap it was. Last tenant left suddenly, he'd said, not meeting her eyes. No issues with the apartment, just personal circumstances. Cora hadn't asked what circumstances. She'd been too relieved to find something within her budget, something that didn't require employment references she couldn't provide or rental history she didn't have. She moved in on a Thursday in late September. Her possessions fit in her Civic. 2 suitcases of clothing, a box of kitchen items, her laptop, her medications. 14 months of her life reduced to objects that fit in a sedan. The apartment was empty when she arrived, but not quite. Previous occupants always left something. Dust patterns where furniture had stood. Marks on walls where posters had hung. The ghost architecture of other lives. Cora walked through the rooms, cataloging details. The living room held afternoon light that fell through windows in geometric patterns. The bedroom was smaller than it had looked in photographs. The closet shallow. The bathroom had vintage tiles and a clawfoot tub that would have been charming if the grout hadn't been stained the color of old teeth. Everything was clean. That surprised her. She'd expected the aftermath of sudden departure, but the floors were freshly mopped, the windows spotless, the smell of Brow's cleaning products, bleach and something floral, still lingering faintly beneath that strange absence of scent. That night, Cora slept on an air mattress with her laptop playing ambient noise, rain sounds that Dr. Ringgold had recommended for anxiety management. She woke at 2:13 to silence. The rain sounds had stopped. Her laptop was dead despite being plugged in. The apartment was dark in a way that felt intentional, as though the darkness had purpose, had gathered itself specifically around her. Cora lay very still, using the techniques Dr. Ringgold had taught her. Identify the anxiety trigger, examine the evidence, reality test the fear. Trigger, waking in unfamiliar place. Evidence, new apartment, first night, normal to feel disoriented. Reality, this is anxiety, not danger. Nothing is wrong. She repeated this internal script until her heartbeat slowed, then reached for her phone. The screen's glow was harsh in the darkness. 2:13 a.m. She'd been asleep for 4 hours. Cora stood and crossed to the window. Outside, Baltimore spread in layers of light and shadow, distant traffic creating rhythms of movement, the city humming with its particular frequency. Normal, everything normal. She returned to bed and slept until morning. Over the next week, Cora established routines. Wake at 7, shower, coffee, 40 minutes of cognitive behavioral therapy exercises, lunch at noon, afternoon walk around the block, extending the distance each day, dinner at 6, medications at 8, ambient noise and sleep by 11. Structure was safety. Dr. Ringgold had been clear about this. The mind thrived on pattern, on knowing what came next, on eliminating variables that could trigger spiral thinking. But the apartment resisted routine. Small things at first. Objects moved slightly. Her coffee cup on the wrong side of the sink. Her toothbrush facing a different direction. Her laptop closed when she remembered leaving it open. Easy to dismiss as memory errors, as the natural consequence of anxiety medication that sometimes made her fuzzy around details. Then the smell started. Cora first noticed it on her 8th day in the apartment. A sweetness, faint but distinct, underlying the cleaning product smell that had been fading steadily. Not flowers exactly, more like perfume, something expensive, something with layers. Top notes of citrus and middle notes of something she couldn't identify, and base notes that reminded her of warm skin. She searched the apartment. Nothing in the closets, nothing under the bed, nothing in the bathroom, cabinets or kitchen drawers. The smell had no source, yet it grew stronger each day, until by the end of the second week it permeated everything. Her clothing, her sheets, the inside of her refrigerator. Cora called the landlord. "There's a smell," she said. "Like perfume. I think maybe something died in the walls." Chen was quiet for a moment. "You want to break the lease?" "No, Can you send someone to check?" He came himself the next day, a Tuesday afternoon when sunlight fell through the windows in ways that made the exposed brick look like something from a magazine spread. Chen walked through the apartment slowly, breathing deeply in each room, checking outlets and plumbing and the HVAC vents. "I don't smell anything," he said finally. "It's strongest in the bedroom." They stood in her bedroom, air mattress still on the floor, her suitcases serving as a dresser, the Spartan arrangement of someone who didn't quite believe in permanence. Chen breathed carefully through his nose. "Maybe your shampoo? Or laundry detergent?" "I use unscented products." Cora felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the warning signs of anxiety ascending, because of my sensitivity. Chen nodded slowly. "Previous tenant mentioned smells too, near the end." "What happened to her?" "She left. Said the apartment made her uncomfortable, wouldn't elaborate." He met Cora's eyes. "You want to leave? I'll return your deposit. No questions." Cora thought about her mother's house, about the bedroom she'd spent 14 months trapped inside, about the slow suffocation of being wrapped in someone else's concern. She thought about the group therapy sessions where she'd promised herself and 7 strangers that she would learn to live independently. that she would stop letting fear make her decisions. "I'm staying," she said. After Chen left, Cora sat on her air mattress and opened her laptop. She searched for the apartment's history, but the building had been converted only 5 years ago, and city records were incomplete for the mill's industrial period. She found nothing useful. That night, she dreamed of drowning in perfume. She woke at 2:13, the same time as her first night, to find her bedroom thick with scent, so strong she could taste it on her tongue, sweet and chemical, and underneath something organic that made her stomach clench. The darkness seemed textured now, as though the smell had physical presence, as though she could reach out and touch the molecules of fragrance that surrounded her. Cora stumbled to the bathroom and vomited nothing but bile. She ran the shower cold and stood under it fully clothed until the smell faded enough that she could breathe without gagging. The next morning she called Dr. Ringgold. Olfactory hallucinations can be a side effect of some anxiety medications, Dr. Ringgold said carefully. But you're on a low dose. More likely, this is psychosomatic. Your anxiety about the new apartment manifesting as physical sensation. It's not a hallucination. The landlord's previous tenant smelled it too. The landlord told you that? Yes. Dr. Ringgold was quiet. Cora, I want you to consider the possibility that you're looking for reasons to leave, that you're creating a crisis that would justify returning home. I'm not creating anything. Anxiety is very good at finding threats. Sometimes it invents them when reality isn't cooperating. After the call, Cora sat at her kitchen counter and cried from frustration that felt like shame. Everyone thought she was fragile, that her perceptions were suspect, that her mind was an unreliable narrator telling stories designed to keep her small and scared. But she knew the smell was real. That afternoon, she went to the building's leasing office and asked about previous tenants. The woman at the desk, young and professionally cheerful, pulled up records. "You're the 3rd tenant in 4B this year," she said. First was Melissa Strand, stayed 6 months, left March. Second was Yuki Kimura, 2 months, left July. Now you moved in September. Do you have their contact information? I can't give that out. Privacy policy. Cora returned to her apartment and searched social media. She found Melissa Strand quickly. 30s, marketing professional, active Instagram presence. Cora sent a direct message. "I'm living in your old apartment in Baltimore, having some issues. Would you be willing to talk?" The reply came within an hour. "Block me. Don't contact me again." Cora stared at her phone screen, at those 2 sentences that felt like a door slamming. She found Yuki Kimura on LinkedIn. Same approach, same question, no response. That night, the smell was so strong Cora couldn't enter her bedroom. She slept on the living room floor with all the windows open and every light in the apartment burning. At 2:13, she woke to find the smell had followed her. It filled the living room now, thick and cloying, and underneath the sweetness was something else. Something that reminded her of biology labs and funeral homes. Something that suggested preservation, chemical suspension, death held at bay by fragrance. Cora grabbed her laptop and searched. Apartments smell like perfume paranormal. The results were a mix of forums and ghost hunting websites and Reddit threads, most too credulous or too vague to be useful. But one post caught her attention. A woman in Portland had experienced similar symptoms. Perfume smell in her apartment with no source, growing stronger over time. She'd done research and discovered the previous tenant had died there, not of natural causes, suicide. The perfume smell was the cleaning products used to remove biological material after the body was discovered. The chemicals had soaked into the flooring, the drywall, everything porous, and temperature changes brought the smell back, released it, slowly, a reminder that someone had died badly in that space. Cora stood and began pulling up floorboards. She worked through the night, using a kitchen knife to pry up boards in the bedroom, the living room, the bathroom. The wood came up easily, as though it had been removed and replaced recently, as though she wasn't the first person to go looking for answers underneath. She found it under the bedroom floor, near where she'd been sleeping, a perfume bottle, large, ornate, crystal with gold details, the kind of object that cost hundreds of dollars. It was empty, but when Cora lifted it, the smell intensified so dramatically she dropped it immediately. The bottle hit the exposed subfloor and rolled, and where it rolled, it left a trail of liquid that shouldn't exist in an empty bottle. Liquid that looked clear but smelled sweet and chemical and wrong. Cora picked up the bottle carefully and read the label. Euphoria, custom blend. She searched the name. Nothing. A custom perfume. Then, made for someone specific. Expensive. Personal. The bottle was empty, but somehow it wasn't. Somehow it kept producing that smell. That liquid. As though the perfume had soaked so deeply into the crystal that it had become part of the object's structure, inseparable and infinite. Cora carried the bottle to her kitchen and set it in the sink. She needed to think, needed to understand what this meant. The previous tenant had found this bottle. That's why Melissa Strand had left. That's why she told Cora to block her, to not make contact. She'd found something she couldn't explain and had fled before understanding became necessary. But Cora was tired of fleeing. She opened her laptop and began researching the building's history more thoroughly. The textile mill had been converted in 2019. Before that, it had been abandoned for 14 years. Before that, it had operated until 2005. When it closed due to declining business. She dug deeper into city archives looking for accidents, deaths, anything that might explain the bottle. She found it in a newspaper article from 2003. Sarah Matheson, 28, employee at Divisadero Textiles, had died on site. Industrial accident, the article claimed. Machinery malfunction. Her body had been found by co-workers in the dyeing room, the same room that was now Cora's apartment. The article included a photo. Sarah Matheson, smiling at a company picnic, wearing a sundress and expensive sunglasses, beautiful in the specific way of people who knew they were beautiful, and had built their identity around it. Cora zoomed in on the photo. On the picnic table next to Sarah was a large crystal perfume bottle with gold details. The same bottle sitting in Cora's sink. She read everything she could find about Sarah Matheson. There wasn't much. She'd worked at the mill for 3 years. No family mentioned in the obituary. No follow-up articles about the accident investigation. Just the brief notice of her death, and then silence, as though she'd been erased from the public record. As though someone had decided her story wasn't worth preserving. Cora looked at the bottle in her sink. The liquid, impossible liquid, shouldn't exist liquid, had pooled around it. And in the kitchen light, it seemed to shimmer with colors that didn't quite belong in the visible spectrum. She understood then what she was looking at. Not perfume, preservative. The chemicals used to embalm, to maintain, to keep bodies fresh for viewing, mixed with perfume to disguise the smell, to make death presentable, to transform ending into something fragrant and sweet. Sarah Matheson hadn't died in an accident. She'd died in the dyeing room, yes, but not from machinery. She'd been killed by someone for some reason, and her body had been preserved, hidden, kept somewhere in this building for weeks or months while the mill continued operating, while co-workers walked past her every day without knowing, while her essence soaked into the walls and floor and foundation. The bottle was what remained, the physical object that had held the chemicals used to preserve her, so saturated with those fluids that it could never be empty, that it would continue producing the smell of her preservation forever. Cora picked up her phone to call the police, then stopped. What would she tell them? That she'd found a perfume bottle under her floor, that it smelled wrong, that she suspected a 20-year-old industrial accident was actually murder. They'd dismiss her as unstable, as a woman with documented anxiety creating paranoid narratives. And more than that, more than fear of not being believed, was the realization that calling the police wouldn't change anything. Sarah Matheson was gone. Her killer, if there'd been a killer, was long gone too. The mill was closed, converted, transformed into living spaces for people who would never know what had happened in these rooms. Cora could expose it, could make noise, could force an investigation that would accomplish nothing except ensuring she could never afford rent anywhere again, that she'd be forever marked as the woman who created problems, who saw violence where records showed only accident. Or she could keep the secret, could put the floorboards back, could throw the bottle away and pretend she'd never found it, could live in this apartment where someone had died badly, where preservation chemicals had soaked so deeply into the structure that temperature changes would bring Sarah Matheson back as scent, as memory, as presence, could prove to herself and Dr. Ringgold and her mother and everyone who'd watched her collapse that she was strong enough to stay, even knowing what she knew, even living with ghosts. Cora stood in her kitchen as dawn broke, holding the perfume bottle, feeling the weight of it in her hands. She thought about Sarah Matheson, 28 years old, beautiful, dead, reduced to a smell that 3 tenants had fled from. She thought about how easily women disappeared, how quickly their stories were sanitized, how thoroughly their violence was smoothed into accident and tragedy and unfortunate circumstances. She thought about how she'd spent 14 months in her mother's house, afraid of everything, unable to trust her perceptions, slowly suffocating under the weight of her own fear. Then she opened the perfume bottle and breathed deeply. The smell was overwhelming, sweet and chemical and laced with something darker, something that tasted like metal on her tongue. She breathed it in until her lungs ached, until the smell became part of her, until she couldn't separate the fragrance from her own breath. Dr. Ringgold had been right about one thing. The mind was very good at manufacturing threats, but sometimes threats were real. Sometimes the smell in your apartment was evidence of violence. Sometimes your anxiety was the only thing protecting you from accepting terrible truths. And sometimes you needed to stop running. Cora put the perfume bottle back under the floorboards and replaced them carefully. She cleaned the liquid from her kitchen sink. She opened all her windows and let autumn air cycle through the apartment until the smell faded to something bearable, something she could live with. That night, she slept in her bedroom for the first time in 3 days. She woke at 2:13 to find the smell had returned, stronger than before, as though her acceptance had given it permission to exist fully, as though Sarah Matheson was grateful that someone finally knew, finally understood. Cora lay in the darkness and breathed the smell of preservation, of perfume, of death made fragrant. and felt something in her chest that might have been anxiety or might have been relief. She would stay. She would live here. She would share this space with what remained of Sarah Matheson. And every morning she would wake and prove that she was strong enough to live with ghosts, strong enough to know terrible things, strong enough to stay when every instinct screamed at her to run. Dr. Ringgold called the next week to check in. "How's the apartment?" "I'm adjusting," Cora said. "And the smell? I've gotten used to it." "That's excellent progress. The mind adapts remarkably well once we stop fighting reality." Cora agreed and ended the call. Through her window, Baltimore sprawled under October light, the city humming with its particular frequency, normal and mundane and full of small violences no one talked about, full of women who'd disappeared and been marked as accidents, full of apartments that held memories of who they'd been. She looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw how much weight she'd lost in 3 weeks, how dark the circles under her eyes had become, how she'd started resembling something preserved rather than something living. But she was staying. That was what mattered. She was strong enough to stay, even if staying meant breathing death every night, even if staying meant slowly becoming the thing she shared space with. Even if, in the mirror, she could see her own face starting to look less like Cora Geller and more like the woman in the newspaper photo from 20 years ago. Beautiful and doomed, and floating in preservative disguised as perfume. Story 3. Nolan Hetherington first heard the singing on his 16th night at Point Malachi Lighthouse. He was 47 years old and 2 months into a 6-month posting, alone on the granite outcrop 3 miles off the Maine coast, responsible for maintaining the automated lamp and weather station, and providing human presence to a location that no longer technically required humans at all. The lighthouse had been built in 1891. It stood 90 feet tall, white paint, over brick, the light automated since 1973. The keeper's quarters were attached, 3 rooms and a kitchenette stacked vertically inside the tower's base. Nolan lived in what had once housed a family, now compressed to the minimum necessary for one man's solitary existence. He'd taken the position after his wife died, after the funeral and the memorial and the 6 weeks of people checking on him with that particular mixture of concern and discomfort. After the silence of his house became louder than he could bear, after he'd realized that grief was something he needed to metabolize alone, away from friends who meant well but couldn't possibly understand what it meant to lose someone you'd known since you were 19. The Coast Guard had been skeptical. Lighthouse postings were 6-month commitments, isolation, severe weather, psychological pressure. Most people lasted 3 months before requesting early departure. Nolan had seen it as refuge. The first 2 weeks were exactly what he'd needed. Routine. Check lamp mechanisms. Record weather data. Maintain diesel generator. Perform repairs. Call the mainland once daily to report status. The rest of the time was his own, to read or think or simply exist without expectation. The ocean provided constant sound, waves against granite, wind through the tower's ventilation, the rhythmic pulse of the foghorn when visibility dropped below a quarter mile. Nolan found the noise meditative, a wall of white noise that absorbed thought before it could become painful. Then, on the 16th night, he heard something underneath the ocean sound, singing. He was in the lamp room, 90 feet up, performing the evening check. The Fresnel lens revolved with mechanical precision, its hand-ground prisms catching light and throwing it across black water. The night was clear, moon nearly full, visibility excellent. Nolan was adjusting the lamp's timing mechanism when he heard it. A voice, female, distant but clear, cutting through wind and wave with a clarity that suggested proximity despite the distance. Singing something melodic, almost familiar, like a song he'd known as a child but couldn't quite remember. He opened the lamp room's exterior door and stepped onto the gallery, the narrow walkway that circled the light. Wind hit him immediately, cold and salt-heavy. Below, the ocean surged against Point Malachi's rocks, phosphorescence marking the wave's collapse. The singing continued. Nolan scanned the water, looking for a boat. Nothing. The ocean was empty in every direction, just black water and moonlight, and the distant suggestion of the mainland's lights. But the singing was unmistakable. A woman's voice, singing words in a language he didn't recognize, the melody rising and falling with the wave's rhythm, beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. Nolan stood on the gallery for 20 minutes, listening. The song never repeated, never resolved, just continued in endless variation, always familiar, always just beyond comprehension. Then the wind shifted, and the singing stopped. Nolan returned to the lamp room and recorded the incident in the station log. 2247 hours, heard possible audio phenomenon, maybe acoustic artifact from mainland, wind SSE 1520 knots. Visibility excellent, no visual contact with source. He didn't mention how beautiful the voice had been, how it had made him think of Catherine, of her singing while cooking, her voice not particularly skilled, but enthusiastic, present, alive. He didn't mention that the singing had made him feel something he hadn't felt since the funeral. Not happiness exactly, but not the numb ache that had become his baseline. Something closer to longing. The next night, he heard it again. Same time, 2247 precisely. Same voice, same melody, same impossible clarity cutting through the ocean sound. This time, Nolan didn't open the door. He stayed inside the lamp room and listened, trying to identify the direction. The singing seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as though the ocean itself had found voice, as though the water was singing to the lighthouse, to him. On the third night, Nolan was waiting. He set up his phone to record audio, positioned it on the gallery before 2245, and stood with his hand on the door handle, ready to capture evidence. At 2247, the singing started. Nolan rushed onto the gallery. The singing was clearer tonight, closer, as though the source had moved nearer to the lighthouse. He could almost make out words now, syllables that sounded like English but didn't resolve into meaning. His phone recorded for 30 minutes. When he played it back, the audio contained only wind and waves. No singing, no voice, just the baseline noise of Point Malachi at night. Nolan listened to the recording 3 times, headphones on, volume maximized. Nothing. The singing that had been so clear, so undeniable, simply wasn't there. He called the mainland the next morning. "Watkins," he said when the dispatcher answered. "Nolan Hetherington at Point Malachi. Question about the station. Does it have history of acoustic phenomena? Echo effects, unusual sounds." "Why?" "I've been hearing something at night. Probably just wind patterns, but I wanted to check if previous keepers reported similar experiences." The dispatcher was quiet for a moment. "Hang on." Nolan waited, watching through the tower's window as October light turned the ocean from black to gray to something approaching blue. "Okay," Watkins said. "I'm looking at records. Previous keeper was Marcus Chen. 6-month posting ended August. Before that, Sarah Voss left early at 4 months. Before that, David Kowalski completed full term. Want me to reach out to any of them?" "Chen," Most recent. I'll have him call you. Marcus Chen called that afternoon. His voice was young, careful. Watkins said you had questions about the lighthouse. Did you ever hear singing? At night? Around 11? Chen was quiet for long enough that Nolan thought the connection had dropped. Yes, Chen said finally. What was it? I don't know. I tried to find the source. Checked for boats, for radio interference, for anything that could explain it. Never found anything. Did you record it? Tried. Never worked. The singing doesn't show up in recordings. Chen paused. You should request early departure. Why? Because the singing gets louder and closer, and eventually you start understanding what it's saying. What does it say? That's what made me leave. Chen's voice was tight now. Because what it says sounds like the thing you want most in the world, and you start thinking that if you could just find the source, if you could just get close enough, maybe you could have it back. Have what back? Whatever you lost. Chen exhaled, staticky over the connection. I lasted 6 months because I didn't have anything I was trying to escape. But you do. I can hear it in your voice. You're running from something, and the singing can smell that. It knows what you're vulnerable to. That doesn't make sense. Neither does a voice that sings every night at the same time and doesn't show up in recordings. But it's real, and it gets worse. Request transfer before you start believing what it tells you. Nolan thanked Chen and ended the call. He stood in the lamp room, looking out at the ocean in daylight, empty and mundane and offering no answers. That night, he didn't go to the lamp room at 2247. He stayed in his quarters, door closed, headphones on, playing music loud enough to drown out everything. The singing came through anyway, not through his headphones, through the walls themselves, through the foundation, through the granite that Point Malachi Lighthouse was built on. The voice was inside the tower now, resonating through stone and brick, making the whole structure sing. Nolan removed his headphones and listened. The melody was the same, but tonight he could understand some of the words. They were in English now, or close enough. The voice sang about loss and longing, and someone who was waiting, who had always been waiting, who would wait forever if necessary. It sang in Catherine's voice. Nolan stood and climbed to the lamp room. The Fresnel lens revolved, throwing light across black water. Outside on the gallery, the wind was stronger tonight, and the singing was louder. No longer distant, no longer cutting through the ocean sound, but overwhelming it, becoming the only sound that mattered. He opened the door and stepped outside. The singing was coming from below, from the water at the lighthouse's base. Nolan walked to the gallery's railing and looked down. She was standing on the rocks, a woman, pale in the moonlight, wearing something that might have been a dress or might have been the water itself. Her hair moved in wind that should have been too strong for her to stand in, and her face was tilted up toward the lamp, toward Nolan, and she was singing. She looked like Catherine. Not exactly. The features were wrong, the proportions off, but close enough that Nolan's chest contracted, close enough that he had to grip the railing to keep from moving, from trying to get closer. She sang, and he understood every word now. She sang about the space between waking and sleeping, about the moment when waves retreat and expose what's hidden underneath, about how death wasn't ending but transformation, how the drowned don't disappear but change, become part of the ocean, become the voices that sing to the living, become the thing that waits at the edge of grief and offers comfort. She sang that Catherine had sent her, that Catherine knew how much Nolan hurt, how much he wanted to stop hurting. that there was a way to reunite, to submerge, to let the ocean take him like it had taken everyone who'd ever died within its reach. She sang that it wouldn't hurt. That drowning was like singing, that the water would fill his lungs the way music filled his ears, and he would become part of the song, part of the voices that sang to future keepers, part of the pattern of lighthouse and ocean and loss. Nolan stood on the gallery 90 feet above the rocks and listened to the thing that looked almost like his wife, and he wanted to believe it so badly his hands shook against the railing. Behind him, the lamp revolved. Its light swept across the rocks, and for the moment it illuminated the woman. Nolan saw what she really was. Not Catherine, not human. Something that had learned human shape but couldn't quite maintain it. Her face rippled like water. Her arms were too long, too many joints. Her dress was kelp and drowning cloth. Her mouth opened too wide when she sang, revealing rows of something that wasn't teeth, revealing a throat that extended down and down into darkness that shouldn't fit inside a body. Then the light swept past, and she was beautiful again. Was Catherine again. Was salvation disguised as comfort. Nolan stepped back from the railing. The singing stopped. The woman on the rocks tilted her head, watching him, with eyes that held moonlight and nothing else. "I know what you are," Nolan said. She smiled. When the light swept over her again, her smile remained constant, undistorted, as though she'd decided to stop pretending. Does it matter? Her voice was still beautiful. Still Catherine's voice, even though he could see the wrongness now. "I can give you what you want. Release, reunion, an end to grief. By drowning me, by transforming you, the ocean keeps everyone who enters it. We don't disappear. We sing. We wait. We call to those who are ready to join us." She spread her arms. "Your wife is here. Everyone who drowned off Point Malachi is here. We're all singing all the time, and you can join us. You can be with her again. Catherine's dead. Death is perspective. From where I stand, you're the one who's diminished, trapped in flesh, separate, alone. We're together. We're legion. We're every drowned thing harmonizing across time." The lamp revolved. In its light, the woman's face changed, Catherine's features melting into different faces, dozens of them, men and women and children, all drowned, all singing, all wearing the same expression of terrible peace. Nolan turned and walked back into the lamp room. He closed the door. Below, the singing resumed, louder now, angry or pleading or simply persistent. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his quarters with every light on and listened to the singing that came through the walls, through the floor, through the air itself. The voice promised comfort and reunion and an end to everything that hurt. By morning, the singing had stopped. Nolan called the mainland and requested immediate evacuation. "Medical emergency?" Watkins asked. "Psychological. I need to leave today. Earliest we can get a boat out is tomorrow morning. Weather's turning. Can you hold until then?" Nolan looked out the window at the ocean, gray and churning under October sky. Yes. He spent the day preparing to leave, packing his belongings, documenting the station's status, writing detailed notes for whatever keeper came next. If anyone came next. If the Coast Guard didn't finally admit that Point Malachi didn't need human presence, that the lamp could run unattended, that whatever sang from the rocks didn't care whether people stayed or left. That night, Nolan remained in his quarters. He didn't go to the lamp room, didn't look outside, kept every window shade drawn and every light burning. At 22:47, the singing started. It was inside the tower with him now. In his quarters, in his room, in his head. The voice sang in Catherine's pitch, in his mother's tone, in his daughter's inflection. He didn't have a daughter, but the singing gave him one anyway. Gave him the voice of a child who would never exist, singing about how lonely she was, how much she wanted to meet him, how easy it would be to slip into the water and become what she needed. Nolan covered his ears, but the singing only grew louder. He understood then what Chen had meant. The singing adapted. It found what you'd lost and offered it back. It learned your vulnerabilities and exploited them. It would promise anything, become anything, as long as you stepped outside and walked to the gallery's edge and let yourself fall. The singing continued until dawn. When the boat arrived at 8 a.m., Nolan was waiting at the dock. His bag packed, his paperwork complete. He didn't look back at the lighthouse as they pulled away. He didn't want to see if she was still standing on the rocks, still watching, still singing too quietly for anyone but him to hear. On the mainland, he filed his report. Psychological distress due to isolation, unable to complete assignment, requested permanent removal from lighthouse keeper roster. The Coast Guard accepted without question. Lighthouse postings had high turnover. Nolan wasn't the first to break. He drove home to his empty house, where Catherine's belongings still filled closets and drawers, where her coffee mug still sat in the cabinet, where grief waited patiently for him to return. And at night, when the house was quiet and sleep wouldn't come, he could still hear it. Faint, distant, growing closer. The singing that promised if he just got close enough to water, any water, the ocean or river or even his bathtub filled to the brim, he could slip under and be transformed, could stop hurting, could join the chorus of everyone who'd ever chosen drowning over grief. Nolan didn't return to Point Malachi, but Point Malachi had returned to him. And every night at 22:47, he heard Catherine's voice singing from the pipes, from the walls, from the space between waking and sleeping, promising that the water was warm, that drowning was easy, that he could stop fighting whenever he was ready. All he had to do was listen. Story 4. The door appeared on Tuesday evening in late November, standing in the parking lot of the Sunnydale Motor Lodge like it had every right to be there. Marcus Webb noticed it when he arrived for his shift, 6 p.m. to 2 a.m., front desk coverage for a motel that rarely had guests and never had anyone who stayed long enough to learn his name. The door was wooden, painted dark blue, with brass hardware that caught the parking lot sodium lights. It stood upright without visible support, no frame, no walls, just a door standing in empty asphalt 3 spaces from the motel's entrance. Marcus parked his Civic and sat staring at it. Doors didn't stand alone. Doors connected spaces. This violated physics and sense and everything Marcus understood about how the world assembled itself. He was 61 years old and had worked the desk at Sunnydale for 9 years, ever since the plant closed, and his 32 years as a machinist became irrelevant. The job was minimum wage and mind-numbing, and exactly what he needed. A position where he could exist without being seen, where his obsolescence was expected rather than shameful. Marcus got out of his car and approached the door slowly. The evening was cold. November wind carrying the promise of winter. The parking lot empty except for 2 cars belonging to long-term residents who paid weekly and asked no questions. He walked around the door. It was maybe 7 feet tall, 3 feet wide, standard residential size. The blue paint was scuffed near the bottom, the brass knob tarnished but functional looking. From behind, the door was identical to its front. Same paint, Same hardware, same impossible vertical presence. Marcus reached for the knob, then stopped. Something about touching it felt like the kind of decision you couldn't take back. He withdrew his hand and walked to the motel's office. Sherry, who worked the day shift, was putting on her coat when Marcus entered. She was 26 and studying for her real estate license, viewing this job the way Marcus once had, as temporary, as beneath her, as something to escape. "There's a door in the parking lot," Marcus said. Sherry looked up from her phone. "What?" "A door. Just standing there. No walls. Just a door. Is this a joke? Come look." Sherry followed him outside, her expression moving from skepticism to confusion as she processed what she was seeing. "What the hell? You see it too?" "Of course I see it. It's a door." Sherry walked toward it, circling it the way Marcus had. "This is like art installation shit, right? Someone's doing a project." "In the Sunnydale Motor Lodge parking lot." "Okay, fair point." Sherry pulled out her phone and took photos. "Should we call someone?" "Who? The police?" "Hello, there's a non-threatening door in our parking lot." "Maybe the owner." The owner lived in Florida and had visited the property twice in 9 years. Marcus doubted he'd care about a mysterious door unless it affected occupancy rates, which it wouldn't, because occupancy was already hovering near zero. "Let's just see if it's still here tomorrow," Marcus said. Sherry agreed and left. Marcus returned to the office and began his shift, checking email, watching YouTube videos, existing in the fluorescent-lit space between day and night where nothing happened and time moved like syrup. At 11 p.m., Marcus walked outside to smoke. The door was still there, unchanged, patient. He approached it again and stood close enough to touch. The wood was real. He could see grain, small imperfections, the wear that came from years of use. This wasn't a prop. It was an actual door that had been somewhere before arriving here, connecting actual spaces. Marcus put his hand on the knob. The brass was cold, colder than November air suggested. He gripped it, turned it slowly, felt the mechanism click. Then he opened the door. On the other side was a hallway, not the parking lot, not empty space. A hallway, narrow and residential, with beige carpet and walls painted cream and lighting that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The hallway extended for maybe 30 feet before ending in another door. Marcus stood with the door open, looking at the impossible space, feeling cold air pour through from wherever the hallway existed. He should close it. Should step back and pretend he'd seen nothing. Should call someone, anyone, authorities who dealt with impossibility. But Marcus had spent 9 years in this parking lot, 9 years watching people pass through temporarily, 9 years being invisible, and the hallway was offering something he hadn't felt since the plant closed. Curiosity. He stepped through the door. The hallway was quiet, the kind of silence that suggested heavy insulation and distance from traffic noise. Marcus walked forward, his footsteps muffled by carpet. Behind him, the door remained open, showing the Sunnydale parking lot and his Civic and the ordinary world he'd left. The hallway ended at another door, identical to the first. Marcus opened it. He emerged in a different parking lot. The door now stood in the lot of a Fairfield Inn, empty at this hour, the motel dark, except for a few windows. Marcus turned and looked back through the door. He could see the hallway, and through the hallway's far door, the Sunnydale Motor Lodge parking lot. The door was a shortcut, a tunnel through space. Point A to point B without the distance between. Marcus stepped back through the door, back through the hallway, back into the Sunnydale parking lot. He closed the door and stood looking at it, his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline or cold. Over his 9 years at Sunnydale, Marcus had developed a theory about his life. He'd spent 32 years as a machinist, making parts for products he'd never use. Then the plant closed, and those 32 years became worthless, became obsolete knowledge serving an industry that didn't exist anymore in America. He'd thought he was building something, family, career, purpose. But it had all been revealed as temporary, as illusory, as paths that led nowhere permanent. Now there was a door, standing in a parking lot, connecting impossible spaces, and Marcus, who'd spent 9 years going nowhere, wanted to see where it led. The next night, the door was still there. Marcus arrived early and went straight to it. He opened it. The hallway was the same, ending in the Fairfield Inn parking lot. But when Marcus emerged at the Fairfield, he noticed another door. This one stood in the far corner of the lot, dark blue, brass hardware, identical to the one he'd come through. Marcus walked to it and opened it. Another hallway, another parking lot, this time a Best Western, rural, surrounded by cornfields. The night sky visible and full of stars. Marcus walked back to the Sunnydale door and closed it carefully. Then he got in his car and drove to his apartment and lay awake until dawn, thinking about the doors. Over the next week, Marcus explored systematically. Each night after his shift, he stepped through the door and mapped what he found. The doors created a network, connecting parking lots across impossible distances. Sunnydale in New Jersey to Fairfield in Vermont to Best Western in Iowa to Holiday Inn in Montana to dozens of others, each lot containing another door, each door opening to another hallway. Marcus started carrying a notebook. He documented every location, created maps, tracked patterns. The doors appeared only in motel parking lots, always in the same dark blue paint, always with brass hardware. They were visible to anyone. He'd verified this when a drunk couple stumbled through one while Marcus was mapping. But most people simply didn't notice them, their attention sliding past the doors like water around stones. The hallways were always the same length, always empty, always silent. They existed nowhere, connecting places without occupying space between them. Marcus tried to understand the mechanism and failed. This was beyond his comprehension, beyond any framework he had for making sense of reality. But it was real, and it was his. And for the first time in 9 years, Marcus had purpose. He began taking longer trips. He'd step through at Sunnydale and emerge hours later in California, or Texas, or Washington, walking through chains of doors, exploring the network. He discovered that the doors appeared and disappeared on some schedule he couldn't discern. A door that existed Monday might be gone Tuesday, replaced by a different door leading somewhere new. The network was alive, shifting, redistributing itself constantly. Marcus called in sick to his job and spent 3 days walking the network continuously. He slept in motel lobbies when exhaustion forced him to stop. He ate vending machine food. He existed in the liminal space of American motels, of parking lots and fluorescent lighting and the architecture of temporary rest. He met others during these trips, people who'd discovered the doors and were using them, truck drivers shortcutting cross-country routes, homeless individuals moving between cities, teenagers treating the network like an adventure. They rarely spoke to each other. The doors created community through proximity, but also isolation through movement. Everyone was passing through. No one stayed. On his 4th day in the network, Marcus emerged in a parking lot in New Mexico and found a door that was different. This door was red instead of blue. The paint was darker, almost burgundy, and the wood looked older, weathered in a way the blue doors never did. Marcus approached it carefully. He opened it. The hallway on the other side was longer, much longer. It extended beyond where Marcus could see, disappearing into perspective. The far end lost in a distance that shouldn't fit in the space between parking lots. Marcus stepped through. The hallway went on forever. He walked for what felt like hours, the carpet unchanging, the cream walls unbroken by doors or windows or any variation. Behind him, the red door remained visible, but it never seemed to get farther away no matter how long he walked. Eventually, Marcus stopped. He was breathing hard, his legs aching. He turned to go back, and the red door was right there, close enough to touch, as though he'd never left it. He stepped back into the New Mexico parking lot and closed the door quickly. That night, Marcus returned to Sunnydale. He sat in the motel office and tried to process what he'd found. The blue doors were shortcuts, yes, but they followed rules. They connected real places. They had logic. The red door was different. The red door led nowhere. It was a hallway without destination, a path that looped back on itself, a door that opened to infinite distance compressed into no space at all. Marcus wondered how many red doors existed in the network, how many people had opened them and walked into forever, never reaching an exit, never coming back. He didn't return to the network for 3 days. He worked his shifts, went home, tried to resume the pattern of his life before the doors. But the knowledge was inside him now, the awareness of what existed beyond ordinary space, and he couldn't stop thinking about it. On the 4th day, Marcus quit his job. He packed a bag with clothes and food and water. He wrote a letter to his ex-wife, explaining nothing, just saying goodbye. He mailed it from the post office on Route 4. Then he returned to the Sunnydale Motor Lodge parking lot and opened the blue door. He would map the entire network, document every connection, find every red door, and mark it as dangerous. He would spend however long it took to understand the system, to create a guide for anyone who discovered the doors after him. This would be his purpose. Not 32 years making parts, not 9 years manning a desk, but this, exploring impossible spaces, documenting the architecture of the network, becoming the expert on something that shouldn't exist. Marcus stepped through the door and began walking. He's been walking for 3 years now, maybe longer. Time is difficult to track in the network, where day and night don't follow normal patterns, where you can step from afternoon in Vermont to midnight in Oregon and back to dawn in Florida. He's found 67 red doors. Each one leads to infinity, to hallways that never end, to the trap of eternal walking. He's marked them in his notebook with warnings. Don't open, don't enter, turn back. He's met others who've made the network their home. They share information sometimes, trade food, warn each other about red doors. They're a community of the displaced, people who couldn't fit in the stationary world, who needed movement as antidote to stagnation. Marcus has lost weight. His hair has gone white. He no longer remembers what his apartment looked like, what his ex-wife's voice sounded like, what it felt like to stay in one place for longer than a night. But he's still walking, still documenting, still exploring, because the network keeps expanding. New blue doors appear, new connections form, and somewhere out there, Marcus knows, there must be a center, a source, the first door from which all others spread. He's been looking for it for 3 years. He'll keep looking for however long it takes, even if it takes forever. even if he becomes one of the permanent residents, one of the ghosts who walks the hallways between American motels, never arriving, never departing, just existing in the liminal space of transit. Even if, eventually, he opens a red door and walks into infinite distance and never comes back. Because this is his purpose, this is meaning. And Marcus Webb, 61 years old, obsolete machinist, invisible desk clerk, has finally found something worth documenting, even if the only person who'll ever read his notes is himself. Walking forever through hallways that connect everywhere and nowhere, trapped in the network of doors he can't stop exploring, because exploration is all he has left. Story 5. The Grief Eater advertisement appeared in Evelyn Park's social media feed on a Wednesday afternoon in late October. She was sitting in her therapist's waiting room, scrolling through her phone to avoid making eye contact with the other patients, when the sponsored post loaded. Struggling with loss? We can help. Grief Eater therapy. FDA approved. Insurance covered. Permanent relief from emotional pain. The image showed a serene woman with her eyes closed, smiling slightly. The kind of stock photo that suggested peace without explaining how peace was achieved. Evelyn clicked through to the website. The copy was professionally vague, full of phrases like innovative treatment protocol and biochemical intervention and permanent emotional recalibration. The mechanism wasn't explained, but the testimonials were compelling. I lost my son and couldn't function. After treatment, I can breathe again. My husband's death destroyed me. Grief Eater gave me my life back. I wish I'd done this sooner. Evelyn screenshot the website and showed it to Dr. Brennan when her name was called. Dr. Brennan was in her 50s, expensively dressed, with the kind face of someone who'd been trained to appear empathetic during hour-long sessions that never quite solved anything. They'd been meeting weekly for 7 months, since David died, since Evelyn's life had collapsed into the single fact of absence. Have you heard of this? Evelyn asked, holding up her phone. Dr. Brennan looked at the screenshot and frowned. Where did you see this? Targeted ad. Is it real? It's real in that it exists. Whether it's effective, Dr. Brennan handed back the phone. There's been research into pharmacological grief intervention. Nothing FDA approved yet, to my knowledge. This might be part of a trial. But it could work? Evelyn, grief isn't a disease. It's a process. Taking a shortcut around it doesn't mean you've processed the loss. I don't want to process it. I want it gone. Dr. Brennan looked at her with the expression Evelyn had come to recognize. Pity mixed with professional patience. That's the depression talking. You're 7 months out from a devastating loss. This feeling won't last forever. But it had lasted forever. Every day was the same. Waking up and remembering David was dead, going through the motions of work and eating and existing, then lying awake at night replaying the accident, the hospital, the moment the doctor told her there was nothing they could do. 7 months of carrying loss so heavy her bones ached with it. Evelyn made an appointment with Grief Eater therapy that evening. The clinic was in a medical building near the hospital. 5th floor, glass doors with minimal branding. Inside, the space looked like any doctor's office. Reception desk, waiting area with magazines, the smell of air freshener masking something clinical underneath. Evelyn signed forms and provided insurance information. The process was surprisingly mundane for something promising to erase grief permanently. Dr. Kane, the physician who administered the treatment, was younger than Evelyn expected. Late 30s maybe, with pale gray eyes that suggested Eastern European ancestry and an accent that confirmed it. He reviewed her intake paperwork carefully. "You lost your husband 7 months ago," Dr. Kane said. "Car accident, no children, no other significant losses recently. Is that correct?" "Yes. And you're seeking treatment because the grief is interfering with your ability to function." "It's destroying me. I can't eat without thinking about how he's not eating. Can't sleep in our bed. Can't do anything without remembering he's gone." Dr. Theo. Kane nodded. "The treatment works by suppressing the neural pathways associated with grief. The emotion doesn't disappear. You'll still know you experience loss, but the affective component is eliminated. You'll remember your husband, but the pain of his absence will be gone. Permanently? Yes. The changes are neurologically permanent. Are there side effects? Some patients report emotional flattening in the immediate post-treatment period. This typically resolves within weeks. Rarely, patients experience difficulty forming new emotional attachments. The treatment is selective for grief pathways, but neighboring neural structures can be affected. I don't care about new attachments. I just want to stop hurting." Dr. Kane studied her for a moment. "Before we proceed, I need to ensure you understand that this is irreversible. You won't be able to grieve again, not for your husband, not for future losses. The capacity for grief will be permanently eliminated." "Good." Dr. Kane prepared the injection. The treatment was a single dose, intravenous, delivered over 30 minutes. Evelyn sat in a recliner while clear fluid dripped into her arm, and she waited to be fixed. The change wasn't immediate. Dr. Kane explained that the compound needed time to cross the blood-brain barrier, to bind to the target receptors, to recalibrate her neural response to loss. She should expect results within 48 hours. Evelyn drove home feeling nothing different. That night, she lay in bed, the bed she'd shared with David for 8 years, and cried the way she'd cried every night for 7 months. But the next morning, something had shifted. She woke and thought about David, and the thought was neutral. Not happy, not sad, just factual. David had existed. David was dead. This was information, not wound. Evelyn sat up in bed and tested the absence. She thought about the accident. David's car crushed by the semi-truck, the funeral, the empty house. The thoughts came clearly, perfectly remembered, but without the chest-crushing weight they'd carried yesterday. It was like someone had removed a parasite from her chest. Like she could breathe fully for the first time in months. She called Dr. Brennan's office and canceled her weekly appointment. Then she called her sister, who'd been checking on her daily with increasing desperation, and told her she was fine now, really fine, and no, she didn't need to talk about it. By the end of the first week, Evelyn had resumed most of her pre-loss activities. She returned to work full-time, started going to the gym again, cleaned out David's belongings without crying, donating his clothes to Goodwill with the same emotional investment as throwing out expired milk. Her friends noticed the change. They called it healing and moving on, and were relieved that she seemed to be herself again. But Evelyn knew she wasn't healing. She was simply not grieving. The difference was subtle but crucial. Dr. Brennan called her after the third missed appointment. "I wanted to check in. Your sister mentioned you got some kind of treatment. Grief eater. It worked. Evelyn, I'd really like you to come in. We should talk about this." "Why?" "I'm better. Because pharmaceutical intervention for grief it's not standard care. I'm concerned about what you might be suppressing." "I'm not suppressing anything. I just don't feel it anymore." Dr. Brennan was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel about David now?" Evelyn thought about her husband. 8 years together. The way he'd made coffee too strong, his terrible singing in the shower, the shape of his body next to hers in bed. All remembered perfectly, all emotionally inert. I feel like he was an important person who's no longer alive. I feel the way you'd feel about a historical figure you admired. That doesn't worry you. Why would it worry me? I can function now. I'm not crying myself to sleep. I'm not useless. This is exactly what I wanted. After the call, Evelyn sat in her living room, the room she and David had decorated together, the couch they'd chosen, the art they'd picked out, and tried to feel something about his absence. Nothing came. She tried harder, deliberately thinking about moments that should hurt. Their wedding day, their last conversation before the accident, the sound of his voice saying, "I love you." The memories were intact, but they produced no emotional response beyond mild nostalgia. The kind you might feel looking at childhood photographs of someone else's family. Evelyn recognized this should disturb her, but disturbance required emotional investment, and emotional investment was precisely what had been excised. Over the next month, other changes became apparent. She went to her niece's birthday party and felt nothing watching the 5-year-old blow out candles. She watched movies that should have made her cry and felt only intellectual appreciation for the craft. She listened to music David had loved and heard only melody, no memory, no longing. Her emotional range had narrowed to a band between contentment and mild irritation. Everything else, joy, sorrow, fear, love, had been smoothed into flatness. Dr. Kane had mentioned emotional flattening. He'd said it was temporary, but Evelyn was beginning to suspect he'd lied or been wrong. The flattening was permanent, a necessary consequence of eliminating grief's neural pathways. You couldn't remove grief without removing the capacity for deep feeling. She made an appointment at the Grief Eater Clinic. Dr. Kane reviewed her status. The treatment worked perfectly, he said. You're no longer experiencing grief about your husband's death. But I'm not experiencing anything. I can't feel happy. I can't feel scared. I can't feel much of anything beyond neutral. That's within normal parameters. Your emotional baseline has adjusted. You said it was temporary. For some patients, emotional range returns fully. For others, the adjustment is permanent. The grief pathways were deeply integrated into your broader emotional architecture. Eliminating them required collateral modification. You didn't tell me that before treatment. Dr. Kane looked at her with those pale gray eyes. Would it have changed your decision? Evelyn thought about the 7 months before treatment. The weight, the crying, the inability to function, the feeling that grief was digesting her from inside, consuming everything she was until only pain remained. No, she admitted. Then the treatment was successful. You're no longer suffering. I'm not anything. Dr. Kane nodded slowly. That's correct. You traded suffering for neutrality. Many patients find this preferable. Evelyn left the clinic and drove home through November evening, past houses with lights on and families inside, past stores with holiday decorations already appearing, past the intersection where David's accident had occurred. She looked at the intersection, the specific spot where the semi had run the red light, where David's car had been crushed, where her life had divided into before and after. She felt nothing, not relief, not sadness, just the acknowledgement that something significant had happened there, the way you might acknowledge historical plaques marking battles or assassinations. That night, Evelyn tried to force herself to feel. She looked through photographs of David, watched their wedding video, Read love letters he'd written her during their brief long-distance period early in the relationship. Nothing. She called her sister. "I think I made a mistake." "With what?" "The treatment. I can't feel anything anymore." Her sister was quiet. "But you're not crying every day. You sound better. You sound like yourself." "I'm not myself. I'm a version of myself with everything important removed." "Evelyn, you were drowning. You couldn't work, couldn't leave your house, couldn't do anything but cry about David. If the price of functioning is not feeling as intensely, isn't that worth it?" Evelyn wanted to argue, but the argument required passion, required conviction, required caring enough about the distinction to fight for it. And she didn't care. That was the problem. She didn't care that she didn't care. She didn't care that her marriage had been reduced to neutral memory. She didn't care that she'd traded grief for nothing, that she'd eliminated suffering by eliminating her capacity to feel deeply about anything. The treatment had worked exactly as designed. It had removed grief by removing the neural substrate that made grief possible, and in doing so, it had removed everything else that mattered. Evelyn hung up and sat in her empty house in the silence that used to crush her and now just existed. She thought about Dr. Kane's question. Would it have changed her decision? No. Even knowing the cost, even understanding that she'd trade her capacity for deep feeling for relief from pain, she would have made the same choice. Because 7 months of grief had been unbearable, because suffering had destroyed her, because she would rather feel nothing than feel that much pain. And this flatness, this neutrality, this existence without peaks or valleys, this was better. Or not better exactly. Just bearable, and bearing was all she had left. Evelyn looked at her phone, at the photograph of David that was still her lock screen. His face was familiar, beloved once, now just another image among thousands she'd seen that day. She didn't change it, not out of sentiment, just because changing it would require caring enough to make the choice. And caring was beyond her now, had been beyond her since the moment the grief eater took root in her neural pathways and ate everything that made loss hurt, and in eating loss, ate everything that made joy possible, ate everything that made fear real, ate everything that made love worth having. She was functional now, fixed, healed in the way that amputation heals by removing the diseased limb entirely. Dr. Brennan would call this depression. Her sister would call it adjustment. Dr. Kane would call it successful treatment. Evelyn called it nothing, because nothing was what remained after the grief eater finished its meal and moved on, leaving her alive and functional and empty, wandering through her life like a guest in a house she used to own, recognizing everything, feeling nothing, existing in the space between suffering and peace where all that remained was survival. And survival, she was learning, was the least interesting way to be alive. Thank you for spending these hours with me in the darkness. We've wandered through parking lots and lighthouses, through apartments that remember their dead, through doors that lead everywhere and nowhere, through grief made pharmaceutical and loss made bearable. If these stories found you where you needed them, if they kept you company through your night, consider subscribing. There are always more stories waiting in the stillness, always more shadows with shapes worth examining. Sleep well, if sleep is what you're seeking, or stay awake, if wakefulness suits you better. This has been the Stillness Broadcast, and the darkness, as always, is listening.